The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of H.R. 2181, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to provide for the withdrawal and protection of certain federal land in the state of New Mexico.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read and for the first time. General debate shall be confined to the bill and the amendment specified in Section 3 of House Resolution 653 and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking member of the Committee of Natural Resources, the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Howland, and the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar. Each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Duhinome Itzartiwitsa Shuimi Hanu. My name is Deborah Holland. I'm from the Turquoise Clan and an enrolled member of Laguna Pueblo. I wish to acknowledge that we are on Indian land, and I humbly ask to speak on this important bill. Mr. Chair, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 2181, the Chaco Cultural Heritage Area Protection Act. And first, I would like to thank my colleague, Assistant Speaker Ben Ray Lujan, Senator Tom Udall, Senator Martin Heinrich for their years of hard work on this important legislation. This proposal, sponsored by my good friend and fellow New Mexico representative, Mr. Lujan, would protect the cultural resources at Chaco Culture National Historic Park, as well as New Mexico's clean air from the impacts of oil and gas extraction. This bill would withdraw lands in a 10-mile buffer zone around Chaco Culture National Historic Park to protect that site and the region's undiscovered resources from the impacts of further oil and gas extraction. Chaco Canyon and the greater Chaco region have been home to my people for centuries. As a 35th generation New Mexican and a descendant of the indigenous inhabitants of what is now the Southwest United States, I can say that there are few places more exceptional than the Chaco region. Over hundreds of years, my ancestors engineered and constructed massive multi-story structures at Chaco Canyon that became the ceremonial, administrative, and economic center of the region. It is a certified international dark sky park where visitors can gaze at the same dark sky with myriad stars that my ancestors did over 1,000 years ago. These sites and the objects they contain tell the history of my people and connect us to our past. The Indian Pueblos and the Navajo Nation still have intimate connections with the greater Chaco region, recognizing the area as a spiritual place to be honored and respected. This Congress, the National Resources Committee, has heard from the leaders of 4 Pueblo nations, the All Pueblo Council of Governors, elected leaders of the Navajo Nation, the National Congress of American Indians, from senior officials in tribal and Pueblo governments, and from a plethora of Americans, all of whom support H.R. 2181. The entire New Mexico congressional delegation and the governor of our state support H.R. 2181. This bill enjoys broad support on the ground and bipartisan support here in this chamber because protecting indigenous cultural resources, protecting Chaco Canyon should not be a partisan issue. This proposal is about respecting our history and protecting our culture. We owe it to tribal communities, to the people of New Mexico, and to people the world over to permanently protect the Chaco region. Earlier this year, I traveled to the Chaco Culture National Historic Park with several of my colleagues. While in New Mexico, we had the opportunity to use infrared cameras to watch plumes of methane and pollution spewing from oil and gas operations, creating a toxic cloud the size of Delaware that hangs over the skies of northwestern New Mexico. 90% of the federal lands in this region are already open to oil and gas extraction, And New Mexicans are all too familiar with the toxic impacts it has on clean air, clean water, and their health and the health of their children. When you're out there watching the methane plumes and experiencing the dust, the noise, the light pollution, and their impacts, it's easy to see why oil and gas extraction does not belong next to a sacred ancestral site of the Pueblo people. If you don't believe me, you can ask Interior Secretary Bernhardt. When he visited Chaco Canyon earlier this year with Senator Martin Heinrich, he evidently was struck by the significance of the park because he committed to a one-year moratorium on drilling around Chaco Canyon to allow Congress to act on proposals like the one before us today. I thank the Secretary for his efforts, but 1 year is not enough protection for a site that holds centuries of history and culture. That is why I ask you all to support Chaco Canyon today, to support the Pueblo people, the Navajo Nation, and the people of New Mexico by voting in favor of H.R. 2181. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Mexico reserves the balance of her time. A gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to H.R. 2181. This is yet another piece of legislation advanced by my colleagues on behalf of radical environmental movement. This bill will unilaterally lock up oil and gas development on 316,000 acres of federally owned land in New Mexico. The Department of Interior is in the process of drafting a resource management plan for this area. But this process is still under review, and the resource management plan has not yet been released. This bill would permanently ban all energy development in the area before we know all the facts and before a science-based environmental review is completed. Decisions made in Washington regarding how to manage federally owned land have implications beyond the borders of the acreage in question. Those who own land or operate businesses near federally owned parcels are oftentimes significantly impacted by poor management decisions made by the federal bureaucrats who do not live there or understand the needs of rural Western communities. Similarly, my colleagues claim that this bill will do no harm to those who own lands and mineral rights in the surrounding area. But this bill could mean millions in lost revenue for those who own lands along the proposed withdrawal boundary. While it is technically true that the acreage off limits to development under this bill is federally owned, there are lands located throughout the withdrawal area that are privately owned by the members of the Navajo Nation. Now, if you take a look at this map, anything you see in this purple area are owned, particularly in this area is what we're talking about, are owned by the Navajo allottees. So when you're looking at the expansion of this park, it impugns access to that area. Now, as you see, the Navajo-owned lands and minerals are scattered throughout and are located outside the withdrawal area. But if these lands become restricted and further cut off from access points and from development opportunities, if the neighboring land can never be developed as required under this bill, the economic value of these private minerals is diminished, and the Navajo owners will have a harder time attracting investments on their land. Once again, you see the spurting all the way through this area, particularly in this band alongside there. So access is critical. We heard testimony to this fact in the Natural Resources Committee this summer. Ms. Delora Jesus testified in opposition to this bill, stating, quote, "Our voices as allotted landowners are being silenced by the environmentalists claiming to speak for all of us. These lands were given to our great-great-grandparents in exchange for citizenship, and we have rights as citizens and landowners to develop our land for oil and gas as we see fit," end of quote. She continued, "If BLM lands are withdrawn around our allotments, that means oil and gas companies cannot access our lands because they won't be able to access the federal lands. I want to submit this testimony for the record."
This request will be covered by General Leaf.
Further, 2 chapters of the Navajo Nation representing a combined 6,000 residents passed resolutions opposing this bill because it would jeopardize development and potentially, quote, infringe on their royalty payments. I'd like to also submit that for the record.
This request will be covered by General Leaf.
I should note these are significant sums which the Navajo allottees depend on each and every year. According to a 2017 Department of Interior IG report, 20,855 Navajo allottees receive a collective $96 million per year from revenues raised through responsible oil and gas development on their allotments. Quite simply, infringing on their right to develop their mineral resources jeopardizes their quality of life. Furthermore, oil and gas development has blessed the state of New Mexico with significant budget windfalls in recent years. Just last week, the Department of Interior announced that the state of New Mexico would receive $1.17 billion with a B in revenue from the federal oil and gas development, the highest disbursement in the state's history. 2018 was a record-breaker year for oil and gas development in New Mexico, with state revenues reaching $2.2 billion in total. Roughly half of these revenues will return directly to the state's school, investing in higher pay for teachers and staff, while other funds were allocated for infrastructure projects and public services. These funds were provided by oil and gas operations on not only federal lands, but on state trust lands as well. Roughly 8% of the withdrawal area in this bill is owned by the state of New Mexico and can be developed for the benefit of its citizens. Enacting this bill will cut off the revenue streams from both federal and state energy development, reducing future revenues for educational initiatives like those signed into law earlier this year. Mr. Chairman, the Chaco Cultural History Park is already protected and off limits to oil and gas development. If leasing were to occur in the surrounding area, it would be subject to a multitude of federal laws and regulations before any development could begin, including the National Historic Preservation Act, designed to protect culturally significant areas and artifacts on all federal lands. Before we declare a permanent ban on energy development in such a large area, we need to have all the facts. We need to have complete scientific review and stakeholder engagement process that is already underway. We need to thoroughly weigh the benefits and concerns, and we need to consider all those who are impacted. Not doing so could have significant consequences for the Navajo allottees and for the state of New Mexico's budget and priorities for its citizens. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Arizona reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from New Mexico is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from New Mexico.
Gentleman from New Mexico is recognized for 4 minutes. Mr.
Thank
Lujan.
you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, my colleague from Arizona, Mr. Gosar, in the previous debate had some incredible charts that he was displaying, and in it he proclaimed, "The rocks shall set you free." I was born and raised, and my faith taught me that the truth shall set you free, Mr. Chairman. I was also taught that people are entitled to their own opinions, Mr. Chairman, but not their own facts. If my colleague from Arizona participated in those hearings as he said he did, and he heard the witnesses from the Bureau of Land Management, the witness from the Bureau of Land Management in this direct question about the rights of Navajo allottees being taken away. As some of my Republican colleagues will argue that protecting Chaco will impact the Navajo allottees' right to develop valid rights. This is blatantly false. Let the silence sit in. It is false. The Bureau of Land Management testified before Congress and said that this legislation, and I quote, would not affect tribal interests or allottees. So, Mr. Chairman, it's critically important that we have a conversation about the importance of protecting Chaco, because while we've taken steps to defend Chaco, Chaco is at risk of being hurt, of being desecrated, of being destroyed. That's why we've come together. I'd invite my colleague to join us and visit Chaco. Visit with the elders, the women who are there, the children that are in proximity of those fumes that my colleague, the chairwoman, Deb Holland from New Mexico, was able to describe, where you don't just smell the methane. Technology today allows you to see those plumes move into people's homes. This legislation, Mr. Chairman, is very clear. It puts in place a practice by the Bureau of Land Management. It takes out of production federal land The lies need to stop about telling our Navajo brothers and sisters that are Alatis that this will hurt their access to those lands, that this will restrict access to those lands. As a matter of fact, Mr. Chairman, just to be thorough, an amendment that I will offer later today will make it even more clear that this, in fact, is only about taking BLM land out of production. So, Mr. Chairman, with all the work that we have left to do with us, this is a piece of legislation supported by the New Mexico delegation, something that, based on the amendment that my colleague from Arizona, Mr. Gosar, just offered, might understand. It's supported by myself, the representative from the district, Congresswoman Deb Haaland, one of the first 2 Native American women elected to the Congress, and you heard the passion in her voice. She's carrying that weight of her ancestors on her shoulders as she debates to fight to protect this sacred land. Congresswoman Xochitl Torres Small, U.S. Senator Martin Heinrich, U.S. Senator Tom Udall, the governor of the state of New Mexico, the commissioner of public lands. If you need a longer list of elected leaders from New Mexico that support this bill, I can make it available. Let's work together, Mr. Chairman. And the last thing that I'll say is I'm very proud that this legislation will pass with bipartisan support. Pray on it. Think about where our loved ones have been laid to rest. We wouldn't want those grave sites being desecrated. We don't want this sacred site being desecrated either. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back bounds of time. Gentleman from New Mexico reserves. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
I thank the chairman. I love the passion in the gentleman's voice. But once again, it's not me, it's the Alatis that brought their voice forward, the Navajo Alatis. They've seen time and time again promises made by the federal government and promises not kept. So once again, who would you rather believe, the Alatis or the BLM? Personally, I would side with the Alatis. And when you look at the map, it tells you the story you need to know. Why, if we're going to make an amendment, we should guarantee access through any of that application through this area. Not just through the BLM, but all this area. Because those are the resources of the state. Yes, I would.
Has the gentleman read the bill?
Yeah.
If the gentleman read the bill, he would see that the text is very clear. This takes Bureau of Land Management land out, not Alati land. And if the gentleman would review the clarifying amendment, he would also see that as well. So don't just take my word for it. Look at the text and look at the advice from your staff.
Once again, reclaiming my time. Once again, it says it takes it off of mineral exposure, but it doesn't give access. Now, with that, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate my colleague's presentation here. It's clear and concise, and he raises important points. And I rise in opposition to H.R. 2181, the Chaco Cultural Heritage Protection Act as well. This is a flawed bill. It's simply another attempt by our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to prevent our country from taking the next steps in this era of American energy dominance. What's important here is that American energy dominance is a great strategy. It's a strategy that helps all Americans, those in this immediate area and around the country. The legislation before us will, of course, permanently restrict oil and gas development in the area immediately surrounding the Chaco Cultural National Historic Park. Now, bear in mind, of course, as has been pointed out here, exploration is already restricted within the park, and of course, that's rightfully so. But it's bad policy to create an arbitrary buffer zone for a prohibition on development in the area around the park. In this Congress, our friends on the other side of the aisle have made their priorities crystal clear regarding the management of our country's resources. So far, they have placed moratoriums on oil and gas production in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, in the Pacific and Atlantic planning areas, and in ANWR. Apparently, that's not enough. What we're hearing today is that now we need to ban production in the New Mexico areas as well. Mr. Speaker, at what point do we say enough is enough? The evidence shows time and again that placing restrictions on energy development only increases prices for American consumers. And make no mistake, these increases have the largest impact on our most vulnerable communities. I said this on the floor in September. Many of us have. I'll say it again today. The United States is blessed because our land is filled with an abundance of natural resources. My own congressional district back in Louisiana is home to one of the largest natural gas reserves in the country. We insist that we have the means and the responsibility to use those God-given resources to create jobs, foster economic growth, and pave the way to an era of American energy dominance. Oppressive policies like the ones before us today have been our own worst enemy. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from Arizona reserves. Gentlewoman from New Mexico is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of 2181, the Chaco Cultural Heritage Area Protection Act. Ancient civilizations call the area around Chaco Canyon home thousands of years before the earliest settlers of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. In fact, Native American people have occupied this region continuously since 10,000 BC, creating massive public and ceremonial buildings, a complex system of roads for trade, and beautiful crafts and artwork. Today, there are more than 4,000 archaeological sites, millions of artifacts, and countless sacred cultural resources that provide modern-day Native people a direct link to their ancestors who lived in the area thousands of years ago. Reckless oil and gas developments could destroy the fragile archaeological and cultural resources in that area, including ones that have not yet been discovered or cataloged. In fact, there has never been a comprehensive Native-led study of the cultural resources in the Chaco region. It is fitting that we are talking about protecting Chaco Canyon in New Mexico and the Grand Canyon in Arizona on the same day. Both are UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and both are national treasures needlessly threatened by industry to pad their bottom line. That is why I strongly support the Grand Canyon Centennial Protection Act debated earlier, and why I urge my colleagues to support this bill and the 10-mile protection zone around Chaco Canyon's archaeological resources and present-day communities that it creates. This is sacred ground. We have an obligation to protect for future generations to enjoy and learn about. We must pass this bill to preserve this place, to teach our children and our children's children about the rich history and culture of the Native people who lived in the American Southwest. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Arizona yields back the balance of time. Gentlewoman from New Mexico reserves. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Westerman.
Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 4 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to H.R. 2181, the Chaco Cultural Heritage Area Protection Act of 2019. This unnecessary bill would permanently ban oil and gas development on about 316,000 acres of land in New Mexico. It would also incur $3 million in increased spending costs with no built-in mechanism to pay for it. H.R. 2181's proposed land grab would surround Chaco National Historic Park. The park itself is already under federal protections, including a prohibition on mineral development. This bill would add 10 extra miles of protected area around the perimeter of the park. This arbitrary addition could have long-term negative repercussions on the state of New Mexico. H.R. 2181 would also impact the very Navajo Nation members it claims to protect. Many of them own lands and mineral rights in the area that have been passed down for generations, but this bill would make it virtually impossible for them to develop the energy resources to which they are rightfully entitled. The complex puzzle of interlocking federal, state, tribal, and private land in the disputed area would result in significant hurdles for the Navajo Nation, creating a de facto extraction ban. In June this year, a Navajo Nation representative who owns some of these mineral resources came to Capitol Hill to testify in front of the Natural Resources Committee on behalf of 131 Navajo Nation members about how detrimental H.R. 2181 would be to their land. This bill ignores the request of local landowners and continues the pattern of government overreach in the West. H.R. 21 also completely sidesteps the Interior Department's resource management plan for the area. This plan is currently undergoing environmental review and will be publicly released at some point. To permanently ban all future energy developments before we know all the facts and research conclusions is uncalled for. I've stood here at this podium and spoken at length about American energy dominance and good environmental stewardship because I believe they can go hand in hand. Every indicator we have shows that energy production is becoming cleaner, faster, and cheaper by the day. Refusing to allow safe energy development on federal land isn't environmentally friendly. It's just bad science and a thinly veiled power grab. As foreign energy sources become increasingly unpredictable, it's imperative that we tap into our vast domestic energy potential in sustainable ways, and that we don't arbitrarily restrict future development. Keep in mind that any leasing in these areas is subject to a host of federal regulations and oversight already. Any development must comply with the National Historic Preservation Act and NEPA. These laws are in place to protect and preserve historically significant sites across our country, but that's not the issue here. Instead, we're debating areas completely outside the boundaries of the Chaco culture area. My Democrat colleagues are rushing to pass this bill without hearing the concerns of local Navajo Nation members or waiting to read the Interior Department's analysis of the area. These hasty conclusions are unnecessary with potentially devastating effects on New Mexico's revenue stream. I urge my fellow members to consider the negative implications of this bill and vote against H.R. 2181. Now yield back.
Gentleman from Arkansas yields back. Gentleman from Arizona reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New Mexico is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I would like to first yield 30 seconds to my colleague, to the gentleman from New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from New Mexico is recognized.
I simply wanted to respond to my colleague that was just speaking. This area is within those exterior boundaries of the archaeological sites and findings and indigenous lands that we refer to as Chaco. I'd invite my colleague, come out to New Mexico. I'll take you out there. Congresswoman Deb Haaland would love to host you. You brought up, my colleague from the other side of the aisle brought up this notion that this development is subject to federal law. Could I have another 30 seconds?
Gentleman's
I
recognized.
yield another 30 seconds to the gentleman from New Mexico.
If the gentleman would take a moment and go to the NOAA website, you would see that New Mexico has 2 methane clouds over it. We have the 2 worst methane emissions of anywhere in the country, even though we don't have the most oil and gas production. I'm sorry my colleague's not able to stay for this debate. Mr. Chairman, right now there's a theft taking place to U.S. taxpayers because there's intentional leaking and methane that's taking place. You can see it. There's technology now that allows you not just to, when you're out there, Mr. Chairman, you can smell it, but the technology now lets you see these plumes going into people's homes that live right there. Let's find a way to be smart about this. I agree with that. But there are places we have to protect. This is one of them.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from New Mexico is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New York.
Just wanted to move quick.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding, Mr.
Gentleman from
Chair.
New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise today in strong support of H.R. 2181, the Chaco Cultural Heritage Area Protection Act of 2019. 1,000 years ago, Chaco Canyon was the center of a vibrant ancestral Puebloan culture that became the focal point for ceremonies, for trade and political activity in the prehistoric Four Corners area. Today, thousands of ancestral sites and cultural resources are spread across the Chaco region, while at the same time, pump jacks, such as the one shown here, have become increasingly present across the landscape. Currently, only a small portion of the region's sacred sites and abundant cultural resources are protected within the Chaco Cultural National Historical Park, with much of the surrounding land available for oil and gas development. The greater Chaco region is a prime example of how sacred sites are facing increased threats from encroaching oil and gas development and the Trump administration's energy dominance agenda. The Bureau of Land Management has already leased over 90% of the public land in the larger San Juan Basin for oil and gas extraction, and under the Trump administration, BLM has proposed to lease parcels near Chaco on 3 different occasions. Increased fossil fuel extraction not only threatens the region's cultural resources, it also threatens clean air and water, as well as the health and safety of surrounding communities. New Mexico's methane emissions are already the highest in the country, and it will only get worse if the region is open to increased extraction. That released methane, a greenhouse gas that is 34 times more impactful than CO2, is a significant contributor to the ongoing climate crisis. I urge my colleagues to safeguard our nation against the threat of continued climate change and vote to protect Chaco's unparalleled collection of ancient ruins and the health of local communities from the impacts of oil and gas extraction. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from New York yields back the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from New Mexico reserves. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. I'd love to engage with the gentleman from New Mexico, if he would not mind. Be great.
Does the gentleman yield?
We bring up this concept of methane capture. There's an easy solution. Are you in favor of providing a pipeline? Because what ends up happening, we can recover almost 100% of the methane emissions when we have a pipeline nearby, because then it becomes profitable, it becomes something that we can actually utilize.
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Would it surprise the gentleman from Arizona that they are actually using duct tape to try to seal leaks from methane plumes in New Mexico? Do you think that's allowed, sir?
Oh, let me tell you. I'm one of these technology nerds. I've been visiting with people that have revolutionized and have new ideas in regards to pipelines that would set this on fire. So, you know, if we're looking at technology, we ought to be looking at it in the right way. It's beneficial. We're living longer, not like what we were at the turn of the 1900s.
Would the gentleman
which
yield?
is shorter. Give me a second. I'll give you time. But my point is if there's technology out there for pipelines that is very consistent with almost 100% capture, wouldn't you entertain that?
Would the gentleman yield?
Yep.
I think the gentleman and I may actually be able to find some common ground, Mr. Chairman. There are available technologies today, as the gentleman may know, being in tune with modern technology associated with oil and gas exploration that can identify leaks, can prevent those leaks, and actually can eliminate intentional flaring of those technologies. But first you have to find them, you have to seal those leaks. So I'd be happy, Mr. Chairman, to work with the gentleman to identify a funding stream so that we can identify every leak of methane across America, seal every leak, and prevent intentional methane. And so I think there's some common ground we can work on, because this is all about compromise. And this may be an area, gentleman, Mr. Gosar, someone I respect, that we might be able to find some common ground. We'll take you out to New Mexico. I'll put your eyes on that camera where you can see the plumes moving. And while they may try to fix it temporarily with duct tape, sometimes on the farm we do it with baling wire, as you know.
Yep.
But we should use real technology, eliminate those leaks, eliminate those plumes, and actually make it illegal to intentionally flare. Let's find common ground on that. Because, you know, when they flare the methane, that's stealing from taxpayers.
I'm going to reclaim my time. But I have no problem. And what I would ask in return is let's turn around and go back to Petronova down in Texas, where we have a coal-fired plant that actually captures 100% of any emissions, takes it down into the gas areas, and actually injects it back in, squeegeeing what the rest of the oil and gas is, and then it condenses into limestone. Pretty interesting technology. So I appreciate the gentleman for his back and forth. And with that, I reserve.
From Arizona reserves the balance of his time. A gentlewoman from New Mexico is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona.
Gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grajava, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I raised to add my voice in support of H.R. 2181, the Chaco Cultural Heritage Area Protection Act. This proposal that is sponsored by my friend, Assistant Speaker Lujan, with the support of the chairwoman of the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands, Representative Holland, also from New Mexico, is another important step toward recognizing and elevating the voices and the presence of Native communities in this chamber. As the chairwoman mentioned in her opening statement, our committee has heard from Pueblos and tribal leaders throughout this Congress about how important it is to protect Chaco. These communities want to see Chaco, their ancestral homeland, protected from oil and gas drilling. This is an important piece of legislation. It is agreed upon proposal that balances regional development with the needs to ensure that special places and indeed sacred places are off limits. It fits well into the work this chamber is doing today and has been doing all Congress. We're listening to diverse voices, protecting the rights of Native communities, and conserving our public lands for the benefit of current and future generation. I hope our colleagues will join us in this important work by voting today to protect irreplaceable sites important to Native communities, supported by folks on the ground, and critical to the story of this nation of ours. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Arizona yields back the balance of time. A gentlewoman from New Mexico reserves. Gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Kosar, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Utah, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Bishop from Utah.
Gentleman from Utah is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's wonderful to be back down here on the floor again with all of you. And Mr. Grijalva, thank you for that. I would have been here earlier had you not scheduled a hearing on our committee at the same time as we're supposed to have all our committee bills here on the floor. But we hit both of those at some rate. We have 3 bills on the floor here today. I'm really sorry I missed the first one. 3 bills that are so bad they make the umpire last night actually look good. This particular one has one of those problems that still exists. If the state of New Mexico or New Mexico's leaders want to give away the $1.17 billion you just got a check from last time from this development, that's okay with me. Actually, it probably means that more money is going to come to my state eventually and from that pot. But it is not okay to forget that those people who really understand what they're talking about, those who live closely in the area, really need to have their voices heard specifically. And I have to equate once again, as has been brought up already, but reemphasize the 2 chapters in closest proximity that really have an impact on here both voted against this bill. They both sent resolutions against this bill. Those that actually have seen what it is like to deal with the federal government on that personal basis have sent resolutions against this bill. This bill has the potential of disrupting 20,000 Native Americans, almost all Navajo, who are latis in this particular area. And even though some will contend that the federal government has said there will not be a problem, if we look at the history of dealing with the federal government, then obviously the concerns that the private sector has and those citizens who live in this area for this bill is pretty obvious. There is historical precedence on when that should take place. And until there is some kind of verification of that, then we ought to be very careful in which way we decide to go in this particular order. Let me say also one other thing here, because this is a frustration I have with the entire process, and as we know, bad procedure creates bad policy. But the bill that we just discussed dealt with a park that has a huge maintenance backlog. And even though changing the mining procedures around the park will have nothing to do with the water, it certainly doesn't solve the maintenance backlog. This bill all will deal with withdrawals from Bureau of Land Management lands, which once again have a huge maintenance backlog. So I'm going to say once again to our friends on the other side, if you really want to talk about park lands in Arizona, BLM lands in New Mexico, or whatever those lands in Colorado are going to be, all on the same day, and we have that huge maintenance backlog, for heaven's sakes, bring that bill onto the floor. I mean, I realize how controversial it may be. There's only 328 co-sponsors of the bill. I'm sure that probably would be able to go on suspension. But until we have actually addressed the maintenance backlog and not held that up as some kind of sad quid pro quo or sad element of trying to blackmail for something else or try to attach bad elements to it will actually negate the impact of that bill, we're piddling around here. Bring that bill for the maintenance backlog to the floor. Let us have a vote. Let us move on to solve real problems instead of those that we are creating with these 3 bills that are going to be before us today. Are they terrible bills? Who knows? Will they result in better quality in other Western states that have public lands? Who knows? Are some of the Native Americans who live in that area very skeptical of it? Obviously. Is there a history of the inability of working these things out? Obviously. Should they have worked out the details with the BLM before we actually introduced the land? Yeah, obviously. But once again, we got 3 bills that make that play on first base look really good in comparison. With that, you're a chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Utah yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from Arizona reserves. Gentlewoman from New Mexico is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Colorado.
Gentlewoman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, as we've heard, Chaco Canyon is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And the reason it's listed this way is because it's a place of magic and history. Anyone who has slept there under the stars, as I have, and as I would urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to do, knows what a special, unique place this is and why it must be protected. But there are many ways one can damage a historic site. Obviously, you can damage the very soil that it sits on, but you can also damage the air and the quality that the visitors to this site find every year. Oil and gas development produces smog and gas flames that harm animals, vegetation, and people that live nearby. It also undermines the park's pristine night skies that attract thousands of visitors every year. It emits methane that lead to harmful ground-level ozone pollution, and it is just not worth destroying this precious treasure. I support reasonable oil and gas development throughout the West, my state, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, so many places. But just because we should have oil and gas development in appropriate places doesn't mean we should have it everywhere. Certainly not near or in Chaco Canyon. That's why I support this legislation and urge all of my colleagues to vote yes. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from Colorado yields back balance of her time. Gentlewoman from New Mexico reserves. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, to the gentlelady from New Mexico, I have no further speakers.
So gentleman reserves.
Reserve.
Gentlewoman from New Mexico is recognized.
I have no further speakers on my side either.
So gentlewoman reserves.
And I reserve the balance of my
Gentlewoman
time.
from New Mexico reserves. Gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, I'd like to reiterate a number of institutions that are against H.R. 2181. And to preface that, we set precedents and we codify precedents. So that's why you'll have multiple states disagreeing with H.R. 2181. So for those that are against H.R. 2181, you have the American Exploration and Mining Association. There's a group letter. Arizona Liberty, group letter. Arizona Mining Association, group letter. Arizona Pork Producers, group letter. Arizona Rock Products Association, group letter. Citizens for Conservatives for Private Property Rights, a letter. Denver Lumber Company, letter. Encore Energy Corporation. Mojave County Supervisors, Buster Johnson. New Mexico Business Coalition. New Mexico Cattle Growers Association. New Mexico Federal Lands Council. New Mexico Wool Growers Association. Western Energy Alliance, and Women's Mining Coalition. These are just some of the people that are against it. And, you know, when we look at this board, you know, we have this designation you see in here in Chaco Canyon. What wisdom did they have when they first put this together? That's what I want to ask. The dimensions here are for a reason. And why are we expending this, particularly when there's so little trust in the federal government? I think we just realized that we had to move a part of our government, I think the BLM, if I remember right, out to Grand Junction, Colorado, so that we actually had some bureaucrats who actually understood the dilemmas that are out there in Western culture and in Western states. Yes, Western states gave up a lot. They gave a lot up comparatively to our Eastern cohorts. We gave property to the federal government for stewardship. However, that has been abused. The products that we were supposed to get off those lands, those public lands, have dwindled. Eastern states call us beggars in regards to PILT, payment in lieu of taxes, because we can't tax these federal lands. And we're begging for pennies on the dollar? Something's wrong with that. We're also vested in the community application of the best management of these resources and getting the highest yield out of it. It's like an investment. How do we get the best out of this area? And when you look at this, no wonder the Navajo Lotties don't trust the federal government. Tell me when the federal government has honored their promise. Look at Arizona, the Navajo Generating Station. This is a promise to the American Navajo and Hopi tribes to have work that was dependent upon them, that gave them the benefits of that entrepreneurial and that reflection of minerals. 60% of the Navajo economy is based off of Navajo Generating Station and the mine. That's gone. 80% of the Hopis on the mine and the NGS. That's gone. So no wonder these Navajo allottees don't trust the federal government. I don't blame them. Trust is a series of promises kept. Until we can start honoring our promises, we got to stop. We got to stop this foolishness. There's plenty of land there. I want to see my sites, but I also want my energy too. And there's a way of going about it. We engaged with the gentleman from New Mexico. It's going to be a wonderful aspect to start talking about technology in regards to recouping 100% of the methane and anything else that comes out. I too come from northern Arizona where I can see the stars. I don't want to ever lose sight of that because I think it was Buzz Lightyear said, to infinity and beyond. That's the way we should also be. But it's not about victimization. It's about empowerment. I believe these Navajo allottees deserve their rights to make sure that the government honors their promise. I want cultural sites to be honored. But I wonder what the difference is when this site is held in this parameter and why we're going about the business to expand it even further. Once again, enough is enough. I would happily yield.
And I appreciate the gentleman yielding because one of the resolutions from the two chapters was raised, and I think it was raised by the gentleman as well. So I just wanted to make sure we had a chance to review that. So if that resolution is reviewed, if you look at paragraph 4, which is where the concern that was brought up by the allottees to the chapter leaders, to the very distinguished and honorable chapter leaders, was raised. What it says is this, and I quote, Navajo allotment landowners expressed their concern that the, quote, Chaco Cultural Heritage Area Protection Act of 2018, close quote, might infringe on their royalty payments. They are presently benefiting from oil and gas development on their allotment lands. Navajo communities, including the Navajo Reservation, have always been in a very depressed economic state for many years, and such development of natural resources gives Navajo families benefit in their daily lives. The Bureau of Land Management did provide assurance that there would be no impact to those royalty payments. So to answer the question of might infringe, the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Land Management have said absolutely not would there be an infringement. So I appreciate the gentleman's time and I appreciate the clarification.
Yeah, I reclaim my time. I thank the gentleman for that. But once again, trust is a series of promises kept. When has the federal government held their trust up to the tribal men? And even allottees. It doesn't matter if they're Native American. We've had a number of mining claims that have been stymied because the Forest Service or the BLM will not give them access, even though they have allowed and stated that they would have access to that claim. So once again, it's a hollow promise. And once again, I beseech individuals, until the government starts honoring promises, they're not entitled to the hierarchy of trust. That's just it. I trust people more than I do the government. A government that can give all, can take all. I'm not for that. I'm for empowerment. I'm not for victimization. And what I've seen, I don't like. When I've seen what was promised to the Navajo people, to the Hopi people, it's lame. We're going to take these good-paying jobs in northern Arizona, and we're going to give them welfare? How discouraging is that? Does that lift a person's spirit? No, it doesn't. Doesn't give them upward mobility. I thought that was the American experience. It's sad that we're at this point in time. I think we need to have more dialogue on these bills. We need to have more discussions. Yes, the ranking member made the comment. Good process builds good policy, builds good politics. None of that exists right now. None of that exists. And until we get back to the civil debate on this, it continually won't exist. With that, I ask people my colleagues to vote against this bill, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Arizona yields back the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from New Mexico is recognized.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you. 2181 is a broadly supported proposal to protect the cultural resources of Chaco Canyon. This bill has the support of the All Pueblo Council of Governors, the Navajo Nation, the entire New Mexico delegation, and the New Mexico governor, not to mention any number of elected officials across our beautiful state. This proposal has been worked on for a very long time, and over many hours, weeks, and years, many voices have been heard. If we are serious about lifting up tribal voices and responding to the priorities of Native American communities, we need to listen to the tribal leaders who are asking us to protect Chaco Canyon. The people of New Mexico know the impacts oil and gas development can have on clean air, clean water, and the health of our children. 90% of the San Juan Basin is already available for oil and gas leasing. We can protect this sacred land because gas and oil doesn't need to take up every single inch of our state. This proposal is about protecting a small, sacred area for tribal communities who have a connection to this special place and still use this area for ceremonies, to pray, and to worship. There may be dissenting voices, as there always are when we make changes to land management policy, but we must listen to the elected leaders who represent these places, and quite frankly, the majority of New Mexicans who support this legislation on this issue. The delegation, the governor, and the elected tribal leaders who have spoken in a unified voice and asked us to protect Chaco Canyon. I thank Representative Lujan for his hard work. I encourage all my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 2181 and invite anyone to come to New Mexico to visit this beautiful place and know for certain why it is that we're fighting so hard to protect it. And I yield back the balance of my time.
All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. The amendment printed in Part D of House Report 116-264 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. No further amendment to the bill as amended in the order except those printed in Part E of House Report 116-264. Each such further amendment may be offered in the order printed in the report by a member designated in the report, shall be considered read, shall be debated for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent, and no opponent shall be subject to an amendment and shall not be subject to demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider amendment number 1 printed in Part E of House Report 116-264. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Mexico seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part E of House Report number 116-264, offered by Mr. Lujan of New Mexico.
Pursuant to House Resolution 656, the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Mexico.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And I'm optimistic that this amendment, Mr. Chairman, may even pass on a voice vote, because I've been listening closely to my colleagues from the other side of the aisle about the importance of providing clarifying language to ensure that we're able to make sure we're meeting the goals that we've laid out. And so I'm hopeful, Mr. Chairman, that this may be a short debate, but one that will definitely pass and make sure that we're embracing both sides of the aisle. Mr. Chairman, this simple amendment would further clarify that this proposal only withdraws federal resources. The withdrawal in H.R. 2181 would not impact nor remove valid existing rights. This includes any lands and minerals owned by a tribe or a member of a tribe, including allotment land, and it would include any valid rights to lands or minerals held by the state of New Mexico. I introduced this bill to prevent further encroachment of federal oil and gas development on the sacred sites of the greater Chaco Canyon region. These sites have withstood the test of time. 800 AD. They have stood for thousands of years and give us a window into the past. Yet every year, oil and gas development on federal lands inch closer and closer, threatening these sites and thousands of ancient artifacts within the region. The Chaco Cultural National Historical Park has significant religious, cultural, and archaeological value to the original peoples of the Southwest. Under this administration, Chaco does continue to face greater threats. Under the Trump administration, the BLM has proposed to sell leases near Chaco Canyon 3 times since March of 2018. But I'll also give some credit to the administration. Each time under the Trump administration, the sales were withdrawn by the BLM under the Department of Interior after pushback from the Native American communities. And each time the administration promised meaningful consultation, which is living up to our trust responsibility, something that I share with my colleague from the other side of the aisle. But sadly, the meaningful consultation never took place, and yet the leases were up again for sale only months later. It's time for Congress to heed the interests of the communities across New Mexico who want to see the site protected and withdraw the federal lands and minerals around Chaco Canyon. As you have seen and heard, 90% of the San Juan Basin is already open to drilling. Oil and gas rights are not under threat here. I understand the concerns have been raised by allottees who worry this bill will impact their ability to develop their rights. But as I said earlier, the bill clearly protects them. And if my colleagues have any concern, this amendment provides further clarifying language to ensure that those protections are very clear. This proposal will not impact anyone's ability to develop their valid rights, including Navajo allottees. This amendment makes it clear that the legislation only affects federal government land and minerals owned. Let's be clear. My legislation supports the interests of tribes and their sovereignty. H.R. 2181 is well supported by Native American communities. The proposal has received the support of the All Pueblo Council of Governors, representing 20 pueblos and the Navajo Nation. Leaders were at the table for every step of this process, helping to decide how these resources should be protected. I'll forever remember the conversations I had with Navajo elders and children who continue to share their concerns associated with protecting the sacred site. And I'll just close, Mr. Chairman, by reminding us once again that when we lay our loved ones to rest, we'll do everything we can to protect those sacred sites. This weekend, I found myself next to the Nambe Church in a community where I live, half a mile away from where I rest my head, remembering those that have fallen, cleaning those sites, pulling up the weeds, raking the ground, pay my respects. I can't imagine how myself or my mom would feel if those places would be desecrated. That's all that we're asking is let's come together, let's protect these sacred sites, let's do it together. With that, Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition, although I'm not opposed to the amendment.
Without objection.
Got to give me time. You know, when I look at this, you know, I see the aptitude to try to amend this to give access. I have to tell you, though, it doesn't go far enough. I think what we have to do is guarantee access so that Congress is specifically and intentionally demanding that they have that access. Because as you as well as I know, you know, once again, government problems exist. And I'll give the gentleman an example. In the last land package, we have a land package that included the La Paz Land Exchange by BLM. Do you know what the big problem now has been? It was signed into law. It's been about access.
Our legislation actually said that it did not impugn any of the mineral estate. But then the BLM came back and said, listen, that doesn't guarantee you access to it. That's why I think it doesn't go far enough. I would love to see it say that it requires the allottees access to those lands. But I'm not opposed to it. I think it slightly makes it better. So with that, I'm going to yield to the gentleman from the ranking member from the Natural Resources Committee, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop. 1 minute.
Thank you.
Chair,
I too am actually
the chair
supportive
recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
I am supportive of your amendment. I think it is an improvement on the bill, but it doesn't go far enough because it still is only amending the findings. If you really want teeth within it, you have to amend the statutes whatsoever. So for that, this is it's an improvement. But it still does not solve the base problem that even if you are taking away rights on federal property and you have private rights that abut it, that has an impact on those private rights at the same time. And those are the types of things that need to be guaranteed because those are the people that could be losing hundreds, tens of thousands of dollars because the action on the federal land has an impact on the private land that abuts it at the same time. And that cannot be solved in a finding. However, the language that you put in here is a good effort to try and at least clarify what Congress hopes to be accomplishing. And for that, I commend the gentleman for actually presenting this particular amendment. I'm happy to be able to vote for it. I will yield back to Mr. Gosar.
Gentleman from Utah yields back balance of time. Gentleman from Arizona.
I thank the gentleman from Utah, and I thank the gentleman from New Mexico. I think we see eye to eye where we're going with this. I think we need to devolve this back to the people of interest, the native peoples, the people of the state, the private owners. So with that, I yield back and lay no opposition to this amendment.
Gentleman from Arizona yields back balance of his time. Gentleman from New Mexico is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And just to close, I very much appreciate the attention that was brought to Section 6 of the amendment, which very clearly states that nothing in this act, number one, affects the mineral rights of an Indian tribe or member of an Indian tribe to trust land or allotment land, or, number two, precludes improvements to or rights of way for water, power, or road development on the federal land to assist communities adjacent to or in the vicinity of the federal land. I very much respect my colleague and the former chair of the committee, Mr. Bishop, Mr. Gosar, and look forward to continuing to work with them. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Mexico. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. It's now in order to consider amendment number 2, printed in Part E of House Report 116-264. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in Part E of House Report number 116-264, offered by Mr. Gosar of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 656, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
I thank the chairman. This amendment would allow federal lands included in the withdrawal area to be conveyed or exchanged with state trust entities, as well as Native American tribes. Currently, over a third of the land in New Mexico is owned by the federal government. The 316,000-acre withdrawal this bill creates includes substantial parcels of Native American-owned private land and state trust lands. State trust lands are an essential part of funding public services in the West, especially education. However, federal overreach such as this legislation puts that funding at risk. Allowing the conveyance of certain lands in the withdrawal to state trust agencies and private businesses will help to mitigate the effects of this withdrawal on essential public services and local infrastructure. Allowing the conveyance of federally held land will also go a long way to addressing one of the critical problems with this legislation, which is access. Denying access to these lands to private landowners and Native American allottees is simply wrong. The growing federal estate is not a good thing for the long-term future of the West. Instead of locking up more land like the majority is trying to do today, we should be focused on increasing multiple use on public lands. We can have our cake and we can eat it too. To put it simply, instead of needlessly locking up more land, we should be focused on unlocking the potential of the West, empowering people to enjoy it. I ask my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Mexico seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim the time in opposition of the amendment.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, there's a little bit of irony on this amendment that, again, I can't overlook, and we raised it a little bit earlier. The previous debate, which was pursuant around protecting the Grand Canyon, included an argument from my colleague that there should be some support for the member whose district that we are debating. Earlier, the gentleman from Arizona offered an amendment to an Arizona public lands bill that would have removed the lands in his district from the bill. Yet here we have a bill in New Mexico in the 3rd Congressional District that I so proudly represent, supported by the governor of the state of New Mexico, by the entire New Mexico delegation. And the gentleman from Arizona is still trying to make those changes. Changes I would offer that don't make a bit of difference when it comes to the substantive side of the bill. This amendment would not improve the bill. In fact, it would make it harder for tribal communities to protect the lands this bill was intended to preserve. The gentleman claims that he wants to ensure the state has access to the lands in the withdrawal zone so that they can potentially earn revenue on these lands. Well, there's something that's happened in the state of New Mexico over the last many years. In New Mexico, the state land office, which has jurisdiction over these lands, has placed a moratorium on these lands within the buffer zone because the state recognizes the importance of protecting Chaco Canyon. It's important that Congress do the same. We need to recognize that the importance of these sacred homelands does not end at the bounds of the Chaco Cultural National Historic Park, a claim that has been falsely made by my colleagues earlier today. The entire greater Chaco region contains discovered and undiscovered cultural resources important to Pueblo communities, to tribal communities, to our brothers and sisters that have a connection to this region. We need to create this protection zone to ensure that these resources are not disturbed or destroyed by future oil and gas exploration on federal lands. My colleagues have noted, even Secretary Bernhardt agrees with this sentiment. That's the Secretary of Interior under the Trump administration. That is why he and the administration worked with U.S. Senator of New Mexico, Martin Heinrich, to a one-year withdrawal around the Chaco region to allow Congress to act on these protections for these sites. So I want to thank my colleagues for taking the urgency and the initiative to act within the allotted time that was given to us by the Secretary of Interior. This amendment ignores the importance of these resources, ignores the desires of the state, and would make it harder for Native communities to protect their lands. So with that, I want to thank my colleagues for the time today. I want to encourage my colleagues to oppose this amendment, but I hope to continue to work with my colleagues in the Congress so we can get adoption of this important legislation with as strong a bipartisan vote as possible. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back balance of his time. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
I thank the chairman. You know, I'm not from New Mexico, but I do have an interest in education because that was one of the standard operating procedures that we were promised on public land. If I'm not mistaken, the tribes are beneficiaries as well of that educational fund. And so when you start looking at this, depriving that fund of its due resources, I don't know about New Mexico, but Arizona's got a problem paying for its educational system. It's not because we don't have enough money, it's because we don't have enough land. That's a problem. And so I'm here on behalf of the beneficiaries that the government promised. So from that standpoint, I don't see a dichotomy in the argument. Till we can understand, till we have a better facilitation of that exchange. Once again, doing something expediently, and as we had a discussion earlier about access to those lottees. Once again, government hasn't been the solution that it's claimed to be. We almost have to guide them hand and foot, pushing them to the right decision. So with that, I still rise in favor of this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is an amendment offered by the gentleman from New Mexico. Those gentleman from Arizona, those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 16, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona will be postponed. It's now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in Part E of House Report 116-264. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in Part E of House Report Number 116-264, offered by Mr. Gosar of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 656, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would ensure this bill would not take effect if the withdrawal in question is proven to affect development or economic value of Native American mineral rights on allotments. Private property rights are a fundamental American ideal. The 316,000-acre withdrawal this bill creates includes substantial parcels of privately held land, much of which is owned by Native American allottees. The benefits of owning mineral rights are obvious for Native communities. In 2015 alone, the Federal Indian Mineral Office distributed $96 million to more than 20,000 allottees around the country. At the June 5, 2019 hearing on H.R. 2181, the Natural Resources Committee heard testimony from Delora Jesus, a citizen of the Navajo Nation, Nagizi chapter, and a Navajo allottee who owns mineral resources in the proposed area. Ms. De Jesus testified that H.R. 2181 would put many of our mineral rights off limits and stop a much-needed source of income to feed, shelter, clothe, and protect our families, per quote. Apparently, the voice of Ms. Jesus and other allottees and who have spoken to the committee have not been heard. This amendment is an effort to acknowledge their livelihoods could be drastically diminished by this legislation. I ask the members of this body to put themselves in the shoes of the Native American allottees who have staked their livelihood on the mineral rights on their properties that are rightfully theirs, only to have the federal government strip them of their rights. I believe that is an injustice, and I urge my colleagues to vote for this amendment. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Arizona reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New Mexico seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I rise to claim time in opposition to this amendment.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I strongly oppose this amendment because it would allow Secretary Bernhardt to kill this bill, preventing protections for the important cultural sites at Chaco Canyon. In response to this amendment, I would point you to the text of H.R. 2181. The bill text states, and I quote, "Nothing in this act affects the mineral rights of an Indian tribe or member of an Indian tribe or trust land or allotted land." It could not be any clearer than that. Yet we have had this debate in hearings, in markups, and even moments ago during debate and in amendments. I understand and appreciate the concerns of the Navajo allottees, and I appreciated when Ms. Jesus came before our committee to share her concerns with us. It is important that we take these perspectives into consideration, which is why I appreciate Representative Lujan's efforts to make explicitly clear that this bill will have no impact on the rights of allotted owners. But at the same time, we need to listen to the voices of Native communities and their elected leaders who are calling on us to protect Chaco Canyon. We've heard it already today, but this bill receives the complete support of the Navajo Nation, the All Pueblo Council of Governors, which represents 19 pueblos in New Mexico and 1 in Texas. These tribal leaders want to see the Chaco landscape protected from oil and gas drilling. They don't want to see cultural sites damaged by pump jacks or to have the pollution of extraction intrude on these sacred sites. The restrictions in this proposal are not new. They have been informally in place for years under the Obama administration without any clear impact on any allottees. We need to act now to formalize these protections because the Trump administration and their energy dominance agenda threaten these important resources. Lease sales have been offered around Chaco Canyon 3 times since March of 2018. We must listen to the voices of tribal communities and to protect Chaco Canyon. I urge my colleagues to vote against this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from New Mexico reserves the balance of time. Her time. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
I thank the chairman. I would have loved to have heard that argument on the discussion on Anwar. That would have been interesting to have. And when I look at this, you know, it's become very evident in my time here in Congress to find programs that had no authorization by Congress that were enacted. Interesting. Interesting. Once again, in a government that is not trusted, trust is a series of promises kept. Once again, this reiterates the private property ownership of these allottees to make sure that it is not impugned. I do not see the definition of that causing a quandary. Once again, these are allottees who are deserving and for us to required to make sure that they're held whole. So once again, I find it short-sighted in the application that no one wants to accept. The other side doesn't want to accept this amendment. And with that, I wish that everybody would vote for this amendment. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of the time. A gentlewoman from New Mexico is recognized.
Mr. Chair, we've heard this argument. We've hashed and rehashed it over and over again. And not only that, but my colleague, Mr. Lujan, said it very plainly. The allottees will not be hampered by H.R. 2181. I urge my colleagues to vote against this amendment, and I yield my time.
Gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona will be postponed. It's now in order to consider amendment number 4, printed in Part E of House Report 116-264. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in Part E of House Report number 116-264, offered by Mr. Arrington of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 656, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a Navajo saying that the rocky vineyard does not need a prayer, it needs a pickaxe. We don't need protectionist prayers from elites in Washington who think they have all the answers. We need a pickaxe for prosperity and opportunity for folks living in rural America and the Navajo people in New Mexico. Mr. Chairman, I rise today to offer an amendment to H.R. 2181, the Chaco Culture Heritage Area Protection Act. My amendment would prevent the proposed ban on future oil and gas development from going into effect in an area that already has adequate protections that are there to ensure that these operations won't have any adverse impact on historic and sacred lands in the Chaco Canyon Historic Park. The reality is there are already a litany of state and federal laws in place to ensure environmental protection and to prevent mineral development from affecting sensitive infrastructure and sacred artifacts within this exclusion zone. Energy companies have had a positive track record when it comes to working with the federal government to comply with these laws for necessary permits and approvals. And since producers already meet the standards set in several comprehensive environmental laws, this proposed ban on new oil and gas development in this area, in my opinion, is unnecessary, it's misguided, and it's overreaching. In fact, drilling for minerals already prohibited within the Chaco Canyon Historic Park, keeping the culturally sensitive artifacts safe from any sort of potential disturbance caused by oil and gas development. This bill is nothing more than a buffer zone on top of an already existing buffer zone that has protected cultural artifacts effectively for 100 years, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, if enacted, this bill would create significant access and extraction complications for the Navajos. This adverse impact is a result and would be a result of this checkerboard nature of the mineral rights and how federal, state, and tribal and private lands are intersecting. Even though the area is proven to house abundant oil and gas reserves, the restrictions on accessing federal land would make doing business in that area almost impossible, leading to a de facto extraction ban on the Navajos' private-owned mineral rights. The so-called buffer zone imposed by the bill is arbitrary, completely unnecessary, again, in my opinion. The whole purpose of establishing the Chaco Culture National Historic Area was to protect every area of historic significance, and again, it's worked for a century now. That goal has already been achieved. The protection is already ensured. Extending the boundaries and adding acreage to the heritage area will not enhance protection of areas of historical significance, but instead will limit the potential of private landowners to steward and reap the rewards of their privately held land passed down to them from their ancestors. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New Mexico seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I rise to claim the time in opposition to the amendment.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I strongly oppose this amendment because it would negate the withdrawal. It would prevent us from protecting Chaco Canyon. The gentleman's amendment would allow for new drilling to occur on lands within the withdrawal area so long as certain standards are met. Essentially, this amendment would protect the status quo, a status quo opposed by the All Pueblo Council of Governors, the Navajo Nation, the entire New Mexico delegation, the governor, and even the administration. When Secretary Bernhardt visited Chaco last spring, he agreed to a one-year moratorium because he knew that new drilling posed a threat to these sacred resources. Now, this amendment seeks to overturn those temporary protections offered by the Trump administration and to prevent permanent protections from being enacted. That cannot stand. Furthermore, this amendment contains numerous drafting edits that would make it impossible to enact. It names the park site incorrectly. It refers to undefined terms, and its unclear wording would essentially allow anyone to drill in the withdrawal area. This is clearly not a good faith amendment, and it is clearly not an amendment intended to improve this proposal. It's simply an attempt to open these sacred lands, with resources that extend beyond the park to extraction, because some of our colleagues cannot be satisfied until every acre of land in this country has an oil rig or an open pit mine. 90% of this region is already open to leasing. Oil and gas are not under attack in New Mexico. This bill simply attempts to protect an area important for the tribal communities who have connections to this land that go back thousands of years before this country even existed. We have to believe as a House that some places have value beyond what can be drilled from a hole in the ground. And believe it or not, some things in this world are more important than money. Is there nothing that matters more than industry profits? These are sacred lands, lands that connect us to the past and lands that Native communities are asking us to protect. The bones of my ancestors are buried there, and it's hallowed ground. We need to listen to the voices of the people whose land it belongs to and who have had it since time immemorial. We need to lift up those voices, and we need to protect Chaco Canyon. I encourage my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from New Mexico reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, private property rights are a cornerstone of our democracy and our free society. That doesn't just extend to folks in Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma. It extends to all Americans and our tribal brothers and sisters. One of them who testified at one of the hearings, who is a member of the Navajo Nation, said that this is a steadfast personal property right that sustains our livelihoods and our way of life. This is a much needed source of income to feed, shelter, clothe, and protect our families. Mr. Chairman, this is unnecessary. This is one of those times where Washington thinks it has the solution, where we sit in our ivory tower and dictate the terms to folks living in rural communities in New Mexico and throughout the country, folks that depend on these energy jobs for their livelihoods. And I just trust that the local community and the great state of New Mexico knows best how to manage their resources. This is not disturbing any sacred land or historic artifacts. That's not what this is about. This is about a protectionist, activist view to ban drilling, in my opinion. And the state of New Mexico is incredibly dependent on the oil and gas revenues, Mr. Chairman. A third of their budget, Mr. Chairman, is reliant on oil and gas royalties. So I think this amendment, I encourage my colleagues to support it. I think it's critical to make sure that our colleagues know that Washington doesn't have the solutions.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlewoman from New Mexico.
I'd like to yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from New Mexico.
Gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Luján.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I listened closely to the words of my colleague from the other side of the aisle, Mr. Chairman. He said something that matters very much to me as well, that New Mexico knows best. New Mexico knows best. This governor of the state of New Mexico, the state land commissioner, the entire delegation supports this legislation. So I'm hoping we'll earn the vote of my colleague from the other side of the aisle on final adoption so you can join with the good people of New Mexico and support this bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back balance of his time. Gentlewoman from New Mexico is recognized.
Mr. Chair, this legislation, H.R. 2181, is absolutely necessary to protect the land of my ancestors and the land of New Mexico. We oppose this bill. I encourage my colleagues to oppose this amendment. We oppose this amendment, and I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas will be postponed.